In June 2021, Hui Ka Yan was worth $42 billion. He owned a super yacht, a private jet, and a collection of Hermes belts that cost more than most people earn in a decade. His company had built homes for millions of Chinese families, or so the paperwork said. But on April 14th, 2026, it all officially became a crime. The founder of the China Evergrande Group just pleaded guilty to a $78 billion revenue fraud. This isn't about empty buildings anymore. It's about where your money actually went. Hui Ka Yan, founder of China Evergrande Group, then 67 years old, stood in a Shenzhen courtroom looking visibly thinned and somber. A man who once wore gold Hermes buckles to shareholder meetings. Between 2019 and 2020, his flagship unit, Hangda Real Estate Group, inflated its reported earnings by approximately $78 billion, 564 billion yuan, using fraudulent accounting entries that passed through audited financial statements. Not estimates, not projections, fabricated numbers, filed as fact, rated as investment grade. The machine ran for 2 years without a single public alarm. Here is the mechanism that made it possible. Across China, developers collected full payment from homebuyers before a single foundation was poured, a system called pre-sales. Every yuan of that cash was supposed to sit in a protected account, ring-fenced for construction. Instead, according to findings presented at the Shenzhen Intermediate People's Court in April 2026, 100% of those collected funds were systematically redirected, not to build the homes, but to buy more land. More land meant more pre-sales. More pre-sales meant more cash. The cycle fed itself. It left 1,300 unfinished projects, 280 cities. The families who paid were not the only ones deceived. Local governments had mandated escrow accounts, which are basically locked savings accounts meant only for building. A forensic audit conducted by Alvarez and Marsal in 2025 found that in over 60% of stalled projects, those escrow accounts were empty, not underfunded. Empty. Developers had routed the money out through unauthorized loans between their own companies, a mechanism that bypassed the withdrawal controls entirely. The regulator's lock had a key. The developers had copies. The buildings existed on paper. Not as promises, not as projections, as legally registered assets, rated and filed, sitting on balance sheets as 90% complete. Liquidators working through the wreckage later discovered that many of these so-called high-yield bond collateral assets were shells. No plumbing, no electrical power, no functioning infrastructure of any kind. But the internal balance sheets said otherwise. The documents said 90%. The building said nothing, because there was no building to speak. This was not a Chinese invention. In April 2025, Aaron and Eli Puretz, a father and son duo, U.S. investors operating in commercial real estate, were sentenced for a $45 million mortgage fraud built on the same architecture. They submitted inflated purchase contracts to lenders, contracts that described assets at values the underlying properties could never support. The lenders funded against the paper. The paper was the product. When investigators from the U.S. Department of Justice, or the DOJ, and the FHFA OIG, the government's housing watchdog, pulled the thread, what they found beneath the contracts was not commercial real estate. It was the contract itself, dressed as collateral. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. A lender does not walk the floors of every building it finances. It reads the document. It checks the registration. It verifies the legal status. And if the legal status says the asset is 90% complete, the lender advances funds against 90% of the asset's projected value. The fraud lives in the gap between the document and the physical world. Close that gap with a stamp, a signature, and a subsidiary company willing to sign the transfer. And the ghost becomes collateral. The money moves. The building does not. While the shells were being raided and the bonds were being sold, a parallel operation was running in the opposite direction. By November 2025, Hong Kong High Court records showed that court orders had frozen $220 million in assets belonging to Ding Yu Mei, the ex-wife of Hui Ka Yan, spread across Canada and the United Kingdom. The mechanism was not theft in the conventional sense. The money had been moved as dividends or company profit payouts, legitimate on its face. To a detective, it was capital flight wearing a business suit. The dividend was the exit door. While homebuyers were signing contracts in Shenzhen showrooms and bond investors were pricing yield in Hong Kong, the people who built the machine were already moving its proceeds offshore, through legal structures, across multiple countries, in a form that looked, on every document, exactly like ordinary corporate income. By November 2025, $220 million had been frozen. That figure represents what the courts could find and reach. It does not represent what left before anyone was looking. On April 14, 2026, Hui Ka Yan stood in the Shenzhen Intermediate People's Court and pleaded guilty. 3 charges: fundraising fraud, illegal absorption of public deposits, and corporate bribery. The man who once arrived at shareholder meetings with a gold Hermes buckle at his waist stood in a plain dark jacket, hands flat on the defendant's table, and said the word that his balance sheets had been saying for years: guilty. The court did not need to prove the fraud. The founder confirmed it. While Hui Ka Yan was entering his plea, Tiffany Wong, managing director at Alvarez & Marsal, lead liquidator on the case, was already 18 months into the largest corporate liquidation in human history. She and her colleague, Eddie Middleton, are currently managing more than $300 billion in debts. Not claims, not estimates, legal obligations. The verified, court-confirmed obligations of a collapsed machine that sold homes it never built to people who paid in full. $300 billion. No corporate collapse in recorded history has produced a number that large. And the machine did not die with the verdict. In 2025, the FBI reported a 59% surge in real estate-related fraud losses across the United States. $275.1 million in a single year. The mechanism had evolved. AI-enabled deception, fraudulent title transfers. The same architecture: inflate the asset, fund against the paper, move before anyone checks. Now operating with tools that can generate a convincing property document in under 4 seconds. The fraud that collapsed China's largest developer did not stay in China. It found new addresses. This is where it reaches you. If you own a home, the title to that property sits in a registry that can be targeted by fraudulent transfer. If you hold any investment that touches real estate, a pension, a fund, a savings product, the collateral beneath it was rated by the same class of document that rated a building with no plumbing as 90% complete. The system that failed in Shenzhen did not get rebuilt before it was deployed again. It got faster. It got cheaper. And it is running right now in a jurisdiction that has not yet frozen anyone's assets. The gold belt is gone. The courtroom is real, but the architecture that made it possible, the gap between the document and the physical world, the stamp that turns a shell into collateral, That architecture produced nearly 4 times the damage it formally declared. The verdict names one man. The system named no one. Subscribe to Leviathan Files, because the next confession will not come with a guilty plea. It will come as an investment offer.